All right, hello everybody. Welcome to your week 2 content for Psychology 1105 Community Psychology. So, we are of course looking at community psychology research this week. So, we are looking at chapters 3 and 4 of your textbook. Now, I'm not going to go into quite as much detail as I did for last week's lesson, but what I am going to do is, of course, highlight a few important things that you need to know about and direct your attention to anything that I want you to spend a bit more time reading about or thinking about for this week. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about Chapter 3 and the purposes of community psychology research. So what you can expect to find in Chapter 3 material is a basic introduction to the concepts and principles of why and how we go about doing research in community psychology. So we're going to look at, basically the important factors that determine what makes us a little bit different in community psychology than mainstream psychology. Now, of course, the main purpose for why we do research in the first place at all is to help us learn something new, right? So this probably goes without saying. I'm sure you're all probably well aware of why we would ever do research for any given reason. So basically, what we want to do in community psychology is learn about the various concepts that we're interested in and what might be creating difficult situations, difficult scenarios for people and how we can help them. Because, of course, in community psychology, we want to help people overcome issues that they're experiencing and improve their quality of life and well-being. So, just to start things off, right, an example of the kind of knowledge that we might be interested in acquiring in community psychology is something like the relationship between mental illness and poverty. You know, that's something that we have spent a lot of time thinking about in community psychology. And so we might ask ourselves questions like, does having a mental illness make you more likely to be poor, right? What about having a mental illness could increase the likelihood of being poor? Maybe having a mental illness means that you can't hold down a steady job, right? Maybe there's something about a diagnosis that means that going to work at a 9 to 5 job is going to be difficult for you, etc. So maybe that's one aspect of how poverty and mental illness could be linked. Or perhaps we're going to think about it from the opposite angle. Is there something about being poor that makes you more likely to experience a mental illness, right? We know that being poor, living in poverty, is one of the most stressful experiences that a person can go through, right? Worrying about bills, worrying about rent next month, worrying about how you're going to put food on the table for your kids, where the check to pay for next month's field trip for your kid's school is going to come from, things like that, right? We know that people who have to think about these things on a regular basis have increased levels of anxiety, they worry a lot, maybe they feel bad about themselves, they get depressed because, they feel guilty that they can't provide these kinds of things for their families. So yeah, maybe there is something about poverty that increases the likelihood that you might experience a mental illness. This is the kind of stuff we're interested in community psychology. These are the kinds of questions that we want to be able to answer. Because, of course, knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is an incredible form of power. And if we can answer questions like this, that helps us understand how to help people who are experiencing these kinds of issues. So, of course, this all comes back to our values in community psychology, and the value that we're really exploring this week is empirical grounding. that we talked about last week, right? That in order for us to do effective and responsible work, we have to be able to support our work with research data, right? That is valid and reliable and done in a way that is scientifically rigorous. So we're going to be talking about how we go about doing that. And of course, one of the ways that we start this process of doing research is we ask ourselves questions. We ask ourselves lots of questions in community psychology. So we talk about, who's going to go about generating this knowledge? Who is it going to be for? How is this research going to be used? What purposes will it be used for, etc.? And we have some additional questions that we like to ask ourselves as well, like what values and assumptions we bring to our work. How do we improve participation and collaboration? What is the social or cultural context that we need to consider? And at what ecological levels of analysis make sense to conduct the research? So these 4 questions these are going to be our essentially guideline for the rest of the Chapter 3 material. So let's start with Chapter 1. What values and assumptions do we bring to our work? Now, what this is all about is identifying our values. Now, mainstream traditional psychology, the goal of research, or part of the goal of research in mainstream traditional psychology, is to remain what we would call value neutral or objective. So we have this idea, and I kind of tried to portray this in the image that you're seeing here on the screen, but of the researcher sort of behind a one-way mirror, watching research participants engaging in a research study, observing, etc. This would be kind of the traditional setup for a mainstream psychology research study. Maybe this is a social psychologist who's interested in understanding group dynamics or interaction, and so she has removed herself and she's given these people a task. She has a hypothesis and she's trying to watch them, right, to see what they're doing. She's remaining at arm's length from the research participants so she doesn't influence them. Good, right? There's a lot of research where this makes sense, right? But in community psychology, we say that the kinds of research that we're doing, that it's actually not really possible for us to be completely objective or value neutral. And in fact, that our experiences as human beings can be strengths to us as researchers. Just to give you a quick example, the experience that I had between my undergraduate degree and my master's degree, I was a personal support worker for adults with developmental disabilities, and it informed what I wanted to study in my master's degree. And that was a really important experience for me, and it impacted my own personal values. So for me, when I was doing my research as a master's student, I had to think about how my experiences and my values impacted my decision to study and research what I decided to study and research. So sometimes these life experiences can be real strengths because they lead us to make these kinds of decisions, and they tell us what's important to us. Sometimes, on the other hand, we need to be able to understand that our values might not always be such a good thing, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But basically, in community psychology, we say that as a researcher, we are in a place of privilege and power, right? And that we need to understand what our values are as producers of knowledge, that term, right? And that it is actually, we feel that it can be irresponsible to go into a research scenario with community members not having reflected on what our values are about that particular research topic for good or for bad, right? Sometimes our values are going to impact us positively, and sometimes we might not be aware of how our values are affecting our work negatively. An example that I give you here is, what about a researcher who's conducting a study with a population such as the homeless, but this researcher has really negative biases or prejudices about this particular population? What if this person doesn't identify these biases and deal with these biases before entering this community and doing this research? That could really negatively impact his or her work, because in community psychology, our research often does not happen in that lab setting that more traditional mainstream psychology research would happen in. Our research more often happens in a community meeting setting, a little bit more informal. So we really need to factor that in. The second question, how we can promote community participation and collaboration. Now, this is a really important part of our values in community psychology because, of course, we want to promote those kinds of collaborative relationships. And again, I'm going to go through this one a little bit more quickly, but basically what we know is that our community research participants, that they hold an awful lot of knowledge and expertise. And if we kind of shift the power dynamic and say, okay, you tell us what your experience is, you're the experts of your own lives, that helps us a lot. Now, one of the things that I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about right now is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, this is one of the reasons why collaboration and participation is so important. So I'm going to tell you about what the Tuskegee syphilis study was and why this is a big part of our lessons learned in science in general. So the Tuskegee syphilis study was a study that was done by the US government. It started in the 1930s and it went up until the 1970s. And basically what the US government did was they injected syphilis, active syphilis, to rural people of color, men. They were mostly men. And instead of telling them that they were injecting syphilis into these people, they told them that they were receiving free medicine, free health care. What the government wanted to do was observe what the course of untreated syphilis looked like. Now, this study was grossly unethical and harmed and killed a lot of people, and it continued well after the discovery of penicillin, the drug that we use to treat syphilis. Now, syphilis is a fatal condition. It is horribly painful. It is preventable, and it is a terrible, terrible chapter of the United States history. And it wasn't until 1972 that we discovered what was really happening with this particular group of people who were receiving this, or who were essentially subjects within this research study. Now, the government did do a settlement and did make amends as much as it possibly could have and apologized for its part in this particular study. But we know that this was a group of people who were grossly taken advantage of, and it was largely because of a lot of the social inequalities that were happening in the United States at this particular time, that African Americans living in the United States at this particular time were not equal members of society, and they were taken advantage of, they were abused by the US government. So this is an example of a study where there was not that collaboration, where people were not given what we call informed consent. They were not given all of the information about participating in this study. So they could not make an informed choice about whether or not to participate. And I I'm pretty sure that nobody would have participated if they knew what was really going on. They were lied to. So some really, really terrible stuff that tells us about the importance of collaboration and informed consent.